In early 1967, a Viet Cong commander named Duck stood at the edge of a jungle base area his people had used for 20 years and watched something that frightened him more than any bomb ever had. He had survived airstrikes before. Everyone in that war had. A strike came and it was terrible, and men died, and then it was over, and the jungle simply closed back over the wound within a season. The canopy grew back, the cover returned. An airstrike was violence, and violence passes. Duke had learned to live inside that fact. It was the whole logic of his war. Absorb the blow, wait, and the jungle would hide him again. What he was watching now did not work that way. A line of armored bulldozers, fitted with huge angled blades, was cutting straight through the tree line at the edge of his base, and behind them there was nothing. Not craters, not scorched earth that would green over in a year. Nothing. Bare, open ground, stripped down to bulldozed dirt, trees knocked flat and dragged aside like matchsticks. Where the jungle had stood an hour before, there was now a naked strip of land with nowhere at all to hide. Duck understood, watching it, that this was a different kind of enemy than the ones he had faced before. A bomb could kill him. This machine was killing something else. The jungle itself. The one thing his entire war depended on. And unlike a bomb crater, this would not heal in a season. It would not heal for years. Duck could not know the name of the man driving that machine, an American sergeant sitting behind an armored cab doing a job that had nothing to do with killing anyone directly at all. He knew only that the ground his people had hidden in for 20 years was disappearing in front of him, permanently, acre by acre, and that no amount of patience would ever grow it back in time to matter. That is why men like Duck came to fear that machine more than they feared the bombers. A bomb takes a life. This took away the only thing that had ever kept them alive. Now let me show you why. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why a bulldozer could frighten a guerrilla more than a bomber, you first have to understand the one thing his entire war was built on. And you have to understand what happened when the Americans took it away for good. To understand why Duke feared the Rome Plow more than the bombers, you first have to understand what the jungle actually was to a man fighting his kind of war. It was not scenery. It was not simply cover from the rain. It was the single condition that made his entire war possible at all. A guerrilla cannot win a fight in the open. He is outgunned, outnumbered, and outsupplied. If the enemy can see him clearly, the enemy can bring firepower down on him that he has no answer for. So the guerrilla's whole method depends on one thing above all others, not being seen. He fights from concealment. He builds his camps under triple canopy jungle so thick that aircraft flying directly overhead cannot spot a hidden base. He moves along trails hidden beneath the trees. He digs his tunnels and his bunkers under root systems that hide the disturbed earth. Every part of his war rests on the jungle, keeping him invisible. And for years, that arrangement worked. The Viet Cong and the Viet Minh before them had used certain regions of that country as base areas for 2 decades, precisely because the terrain hid them so completely. One such place, a dense 40-square-mile stretch of jungle not far from Saigon, had sheltered communist forces since the war against the French. It was a fortress with no walls because its entire defense was invisibility. Bombs fell on it sometimes. Patrols entered it sometimes. And every time, the jungle simply swallowed the evidence and grew back, and the base endured. This is the arrangement Duke had built his whole understanding of survival around. The jungle was patient, and so was he. Whatever the Americans did to it, it would heal, given time, and time was the one thing the jungle always had. A bomb crater filled with new growth in a season. A burned patch of canopy closed back over within a year or two. The jungle had survived worse than the Americans for longer than any war had lasted, and Duke trusted it the way a man trusts a fact of nature, the way he trusts that the sun will rise or that a river returns to its banks after a flood. What Duke did not yet understand, standing in his base area in early 1967, was that a machine had arrived that did not simply wound the jungle, it erased it. And an erased jungle does not grow back in a season, and it does not grow back in a year. It does not come back in time to matter to a war with an ending. Picture what life inside that jungle sanctuary actually looked like in the years before the plows arrived. Men moved along paths worn soft by years of use, invisible from above because the canopy closed completely over their heads. Cook fires burned under cover so thick that the smoke dispersed through the leaves before it ever reached open sky. Storage bunkers sat beneath root systems, their entrances hidden by the same undergrowth that had always been there. This was not a fortified camp in any conventional sense. It had no walls, no towers, no visible perimeter at all. Its entire defense was that an enemy flying directly overhead at low altitude in daylight might still see nothing but unbroken green. That is an extraordinary kind of safety when you think about it, and it is worth understanding exactly how much it was worth. In any other kind of war, an army needs walls or distance or superior force to protect its rear areas. Duke's people needed none of that. They needed only trees, and for 20 years, the trees had been enough. The machine Duke was watching had a plain, almost comic name for something so consequential. It was called a Rome Plow, and the name came from nothing more dramatic than a manufacturing town in Georgia, where the company that built it was based. There is something almost funny about that origin, if you let yourself sit with it. Somewhere in Georgia, a company had spent years perfecting bulldozer blades for farmers and construction crews, clearing stumps out of ordinary American fields. That same design, barely modified, became one of the tools that most frightened a battle-hardened guerrilla army on the other side of the world. Nobody in Rome, Georgia, had built that blade to fight a war. They had built it to clear land for a shopping center, or a farm, or a new road. The war simply found a use for it that its designers had never imagined, and that use turned out to be devastating. There was nothing exotic about its origins. It was, at its heart, a standard American bulldozer, a Caterpillar D7, the kind used on construction sites across the world, fitted with a special blade and a reinforced cab and shipped to Vietnam to do a job no ordinary machine could do. The blade was the whole point. It was wide, heavy, and angled, and fitted with a sharpened spike on one side that the crews called the stinger. That stinger let the blade get underneath a tree and lever it over, roots and all, rather than simply pushing against the trunk the way an ordinary dozer blade would. This meant the Rome Plow did not just knock trees down, it uprooted them, tore them out of the ground entirely, and shoved them aside in windrows that the crews would later burn. Where a Rome Plow had passed, there was no tree left standing, and often no root system left in the ground to send up new shoots. The cab was reinforced too, with armor, plating, and protection for the vital parts of the machine, because these bulldozers did not operate in some quiet construction site back home. They worked in a war zone, often at the leading edge of it, and the men who drove them were doing one of the most exposed and dangerous jobs in the entire American war effort. We will come back to that cost because it deserves its own telling. For now, understand the machine itself, a modified bulldozer, purpose-built to tear the jungle out by its roots, faster and more completely than any weapon that had come before it. Picture what it actually looked like at work. A line of these machines moving in echelon, blades down, engines roaring loud enough to be heard long before they came into view. Ahead of them, standing jungle, thick and green and centuries old in places. Behind them, nothing but flattened trunks, torn earth, and the sharp reek of diesel and cut sap. A single plow could clear several acres in a day. A company of them working together could clear 100 acres or more, and over a year, a single company might strip tens of thousands of acres bare. This was not selective cutting. It was total removal, moving forward in a straight, relentless line, leaving behind ground with nothing standing on it at all. And the scale of what these machines accomplished over the years they operated is almost impossible to hold in your head all at once. Over the full course of the program, American land clearing units stripped hundreds of thousands of acres of Vietnamese jungle down to bare earth. Entire regions that had been impenetrable green for a generation turned into open, sunlit ground with nowhere left to hide. One American general overseeing these operations called the land clearing battalions the single most powerful tool his command had for frustrating the communist war effort. That was not an exaggeration born of enthusiasm. It was a simple, cold assessment of what happens to a guerrilla war when you take away the guerrilla's terrain. The clearest demonstration of this came against the very kind of base area Duke represents in this story, the dense jungle stronghold northwest of Saigon that had sheltered communist forces for 2 decades. In early 1967, the largest American operation of the war to that point moved against that stronghold, and Rome Plows were part of the force sent in. Alongside tanks and dozens of conventional bulldozers, a handful of these specialized plows worked to strip away the jungle that had made the base area a fortress in the first place. It was not subtle work, and it was not meant to be. Tanks and dozers led the way, plows following behind, converting ground that had hidden an army for a generation into open, cleared terrain in a matter of weeks. What 20 years of patrols and airstrikes had never fully accomplished, a company of bulldozers accomplished by simply removing the thing that had always protected it. This is the operation Duke is meant to represent in the story, a real documented turning point when the Americans demonstrated conclusively that the oldest and safest ground in the entire war could be permanently altered, not just raided. Now you can understand exactly why Duke and men like him came to fear this machine more than the aircraft that dropped bombs on them. And it has nothing to do with which one killed more people in a single strike. It has everything to do with which one they could recover from. Think about what an airstrike actually did to the jungle. In the cold arithmetic of survival, a bomb falls, and there is a moment of enormous violence, and men may die, and a patch of canopy is torn open. That is genuinely terrible. But the jungle in that part of the world grows with a speed that is almost aggressive. Vines and undergrowth choke a bomb crater within months. Saplings shoot up through burned ground within a year or two. Within a handful of years, a bombed clearing is swallowed back into green, and unless you know exactly where to look, you cannot tell a strike ever happened there at all. The jungle absorbed the airstrike, it hurt, and then it healed, and the fundamental terrain, the thing Duke's whole strategy depended on, was restored. The Rome Plow did not leave anything for the jungle to heal. It did not simply damage the trees, it tore them out by the roots and dragged them away, which meant there was often no root system left in the ground capable of sending up new growth at all. Where an airstrike left a wound, the Rome Plow left a scar that the jungle could not close on its own, not in one growing season, not in 5, sometimes not for a decade or more. An area cleared by these machines did not quietly return to camouflage the way a bombed area did. It stayed open, it stayed exposed. It stayed, for years, exactly the kind of ground a guerrilla could never safely use again. This changes the entire calculation of fear, and it is worth sitting with why. A bomb is a threat to your body in a single terrible moment, and then it is gone. You can be brave against that kind of threat because bravery has always known how to face a moment. The Rome Plow was not a threat to your body in a moment. It was a threat to the entire foundation your survival was built on, for years into the future. And there is no moment of bravery that can answer a threat like that. You cannot charge a bulldozer and undo what its blade has already done. You cannot wait it out because waiting it out was exactly the strategy the jungle's regrowth used to depend on, and this machine had broken that dependency completely. Duck understood this instinctively, the way a farmer understands the difference between a bad storm and a poison field. A storm passes, and next season you plant again in the same ground. A poison field does not forgive you next season or the season after. The bombers were the storm. The Rome Plow was the poison. And a guerrilla, who had spent 20 years trusting that the jungle would always come back, had never had to reckon with an enemy who could simply make sure it did not. Follow that metaphor a little further, because it explains the whole shape of the fear better than any statistic could. A farmer who loses a crop to a storm grieves and then plants again, because the ground itself is unharmed and next season is still possible. A farmer whose field is salted or stripped down to bedrock faces something categorically different. He is not looking at a bad year. He is looking at the end of farming that field at all for as long as he lives, possibly for as long as his children live. The grief is not sharper in the second case. It is simply a different kind of grief, aimed at a different kind of loss, not this year's harvest, but the very possibility of harvest ever again. Duke's fear of the Rome Plow had exactly that shape. He was not afraid of losing a battle near his base, the way he might fear losing any battle. He was afraid of losing the base itself permanently as a place that could ever shelter anyone again. And that fear did not fade the way ordinary combat fear faded after a fight ended, because the ground stayed bare long after the bulldozers had moved on to the next stretch of jungle. Every day he walked past that cleared strip was a fresh reminder that the loss was not temporary. It simply was now a permanent fact of his war, the way a scar is a permanent fact of a body, whether or not anyone is currently looking at it. The fear was not abstract, and it did not stay confined to a single base area. Once the jungle was gone, everything the Viet Cong relied on that terrain to provide went with it, and the consequences rippled through every part of their war. Start with the most basic thing concealment provided, simply not being seen. A base hidden under triple canopy could not be spotted from the air, no matter how many reconnaissance flights passed overhead. Once the canopy was gone, that same ground was open to observation from any aircraft that cared to look at any time for as long as the clearing remained bare. A base area that had been invisible for 20 years could now be watched, mapped, and targeted at leisure. The jungle had been doing an enormous amount of quiet, essential work for the Viet Cong simply by existing, and once it was gone, that work had to be done by something else, usually nothing at all. Then consider what happened to ambushes. Much of the guerrillas' fighting depended on striking from concealment along roads and trails, hitting a convoy or a patrol from cover, and disappearing before a response could be organized. Clear the vegetation along those routes, and the ambush loses its essential ingredient. There is nowhere to hide the gunners, nowhere to conceal the approach, no cover to melt back into afterward. American forces used exactly this logic deliberately, clearing wide swaths of jungle along roads and around base perimeters specifically to deny the ambush its terrain. A road that ran through open, cleared ground on both sides was a road where a guerrilla ambush team had nowhere left to stand. Picture the same stretch of road before and after. Before, the road runs through a corridor of thick jungle, pressing in close on both sides. Vines and undergrowth right up against the shoulder. A convoy moving down that road is moving through a 100 perfect ambush positions at once, any one of which might be occupied, none of which can be checked in advance. The drivers know it. Every mile is tense because the enemy could be 5 meters from the wheels and completely invisible. After the plows have passed, the same road runs through open ground, sometimes for 100 meters or more on either side, nothing standing taller than stubble. A convoy on that stretch can see anyone approaching long before they are in range to do anything about it. There is no cover to hide a machine gun crew, no concealed approach for a rocket team, no tangle of green to melt back into after firing a shot. The ambush that would have been trivial to spring on the old road becomes nearly impossible on the new one, not because the enemy grew weaker, but because the ground itself stopped cooperating with them. And consider the tunnels and bunkers, the underground world the Viet Cong depended on for the deepest kind of concealment of all. Those tunnel systems were built to hide beneath root networks and jungle floor, camouflaged by the very vegetation the Rome Plows tore away. Clearing operations exposed entrances that had been invisible for years, tore up the ground cover that hid ventilation shafts, and left whole tunnel networks suddenly visible and vulnerable in a way they had never been before. A hiding place that depends on being covered by jungle stops being a hiding place the moment the jungle is gone. Picture a base commander touring what was left of his position after a clearing operation had passed through nearby. Trails he had used for years now ran across open ground, visible from a mile off. A tunnel entrance he had trusted completely, hidden for a decade under a tangle of roots, now sat exposed on bare dirt, plainly a tunnel entrance to anyone who happened to fly over. Nothing about the tunnel itself had changed. Only the jungle around it had, and that was enough to turn a perfectly good hiding place into a marked target. Multiply that single tunnel entrance by hundreds across every base area the plows reached, and you begin to see the shape of what these operations actually did to the underground world the Viet Cong had spent years constructing. A tunnel network, however elaborate, is only as hidden as the ground above it. Engineers and infantry following behind the plows found entrances that had been completely undetectable a month earlier, simply because the cover that concealed them had been dragged away and burned. Some of these networks had taken years to dig by hand with simple tools under constant threat of discovery. The jungle above them had been the final essential layer of their security, and once that layer was gone, the tunnels themselves were left standing in the open like the foundations of a house whose walls had been torn away. Put all of this together across hundreds of thousands of acres over years of sustained operations, and you can see why the Viet Cong leadership itself came to view this program with real alarm. It was not simply killing men the way a bomb did. It was systematically dismantling the terrain conditions that their entire way of fighting required. An enemy that kills you in a battle is a terrible thing. An enemy that quietly removes the only kind of ground you know how to fight on is a different, deeper kind of threat. And it forced the Viet Cong to abandon base areas, relocate deeper into ever-shrinking pockets of remaining cover, and accept that some of their oldest and safest ground was simply gone, permanently, for the rest of the war. It would be a mistake to tell the story only from the perspective of the men who feared these machines, because the men who operated them paid an extraordinary price of their own, and their courage deserves to be understood plainly. Clearing jungle in a war zone was nothing like clearing land back home. These crews worked at the leading edge of a hostile territory, often in areas the Viet Cong considered their own, and the Viet Cong understood exactly what these machines were doing to them. That meant land clearing operations were prime targets for ambush, for mines, and for sniper fire, and the crews knew it every single day they went out. The bulldozers themselves had armor and protection built into their cabs precisely because the men driving them expected to take fire while they worked. Sitting exposed at the front of a slow-moving, loud, unmistakable machine, that told the enemy exactly where to aim. Think about what that job actually demanded. A Rome Plow operator could not duck for cover the way an infantryman could. He was inside a machine that needed to keep moving forward, blade down, engine roaring in order to do its job at all, and stopping to take cover meant the whole operation stalled. So these men drove forward into ground the enemy had every reason to defend in a machine that made an enormous amount of noise and moved at a walking pace, doing a job that could not be rushed and could not be paused, while knowing that every yard of jungle they cleared was a yard the enemy desperately did not want cleared. Picture the actual working day. A tank platoon and an infantry company moving ahead and alongside the plows, providing security in ground that might already be watching them. The EE plows themselves, grinding forward in echelon one after another, each operator watching the machine ahead of him and the tree line beside him at the same time. The noise was constant. Engines snapping timber, the occasional crack of small arms fire from somewhere in the green. A mine could be anywhere underfoot. A sniper could be anywhere in what remained of the standing trees. And still, the plows kept moving, because a stalled operation was a wasted day, and every day mattered. The cost of this work was real and heavy. Over the years these units operated, dozens of these men were killed in action, and hundreds more were wounded. Casualties that accumulated steadily across a program that ran for years and cleared enormous stretches of the country. These men rarely appear in the popular memory of that war. They fired very few shots themselves. Their job was to drive and cut and clear, while the infantry and armor around them provided security. But they worked every day in exactly the ground the enemy was most determined to protect, and they paid for that ground in blood in a machine that offered them speed and armor, but never full safety. Imagine the moment it went wrong, because it went wrong often enough that every operator carried the knowledge of it into every shift. A plow rolling forward at a walking pace, blade down, engine at full roar. When a mine buried beneath the ground it was crossing finally does what it was buried to do, or a shot from the tree line still standing ahead, aimed at the one unarmored angle the operator could not fully protect. The armor on these machines helped enormously, and it saved a great many lives that would otherwise have been lost. But it was not invulnerable, and the operators knew that every single day, in the specific way a man knows, a fact he has decided not to dwell on, because dwelling on it would make the job impossible to do, and still they went out the next morning. That is the detail that deserves the most attention. A mine strike or an ambush on one plow in a company did not stop the rest of the company from working the following day. The jungle still needed clearing. The next stretch of road still needed opening. The men climbed back into their cabs, checked their blades, and moved forward into ground that had just proven the day before exactly how dangerous it could be. There is something worth honoring here that goes beyond simple bravery under fire, because in a strange way, these men's courage was less dramatic and more sustained than a single firefight. A soldier in an ambush fights for minutes in a burst of adrenaline that ends one way or another. A Rome Plow crew went out day after day for months and years into ground that might be mined or watched or waiting, and did slow, loud, exposed work that could not be hurried, because the job itself demanded patience even when patience felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. That is its own kind of courage, quieter than a charge into gunfire, and it deserves its place in this story. There is a particular unfairness in how these men are remembered, or rather, how rarely they are remembered at all. Ask most people what they picture from that war, and you will get helicopters or jungle firefights or the faces of infantrymen on patrol. Almost no one pictures a line of bulldozers grinding through the tree line, or the man behind the armored glass who has been doing the same exposed, essential, nerve-wracking work every day for a year. Their contribution does not photograph as dramatically as a firefight, and their casualties, while real and significant, were smaller in absolute number than the infantry's. But measured against the size of their community, against the number of men who actually did this specific job, the risk they accepted every single day was extraordinary, and it deserves to be named alongside every other form of courage this war produced. Duke survived the war, and in his later years, when he thought back on everything the Americans had brought against his people, it was not the bombers he described first, it was the bulldozers. He came to understand, with time, exactly why they had frightened him more, and it was not a complicated realization once he let himself see it clearly. The bombers had killed people he knew, and that grief was real and lasting. But the bombers had never taken away his fundamental confidence in the ground itself. He had always believed in the deepest and most practical part of himself that the jungle would hide him again, that time would heal whatever the Americans did to it, that patience was a weapon the Americans simply did not have, and he did. The Rome Plows were the first thing he encountered that made him doubt that belief completely, because they did not damage the jungle. They removed it in a way that no amount of his patience could restore before the war around him had already been decided. He thought, too, about how strange it was that the machine which frightened him most was, in itself, capable of killing no one. It carried no weapon, it fired no shot. It simply drove forward slowly and did something to the land that a bomb could never do. He had spent years learning to manage his fear of bullets and explosives because those fears, terrible as they were fears he understood and could plan around. The fear the Rome Plow gave him was different and newer, and he had no old wisdom to draw on for it because no one in his long tradition of jungle warfare had ever had to fight an enemy who could simply erase the jungle itself. He remembered, too, the particular quiet that fell over his own men in the weeks after a clearing operation passed near a base they had trusted for years. There was no dramatic grief, the way there was after a bad ambush or a heavy air raid. There was something quieter and more corrosive. Men walking the edge of what used to be cover, looking at open ground where a tree line had stood their whole time in the war, and understanding without anyone needing to say it aloud that a part of their safety was simply gone and was not coming back. He remembered, too, what came after that quiet, because it was not paralysis. It was relocation. His people did what they had always done when a piece of ground stopped working for them. They moved deeper into whatever cover remained and rebuilt what they could with less of everything than they had before. This was, in its way, a kind of resilience, and Duke had a right to be proud of it. But he also understood, with a clarity that only came years later, that every relocation was a retreat into a smaller and smaller world. The jungle that remained available to them shrank a little more with every clearing operation, and there was a hard limit to how many times you could retreat into what was left before there was simply nowhere left to retreat to at all. And he came eventually to a grudging respect for the machine's design and for the men who drove it, even as he hated what it did to his people. It was, he thought, a peculiarly American kind of weapon, not a gun built to kill men, but an industrial tool built for construction sites and farms, repurposed with terrible effectiveness into a device for destroying a guerrilla's entire way of surviving. It required no genius of tactics. It required only patience, armor, and enough of them, driven by men willing to do slow work in dangerous ground. That, Duke thought, told you something true about the whole war. that sometimes the deepest threat is not the cleverest weapon, but the plainest one, aimed with total clarity at the one thing your enemy cannot live without. Here is what Duke finally understood about the machine that frightened him more than any bomber. And it is a lesson about the difference between hurting someone and erasing the thing they depend on to survive. An airstrike is violence delivered in a single terrible moment, and then it passes, and the world it struck begins almost immediately to heal. The jungle Duck trusted had survived bombs for 20 years precisely because that is what jungles do. They absorb the wound and grow back over it, given time, and time was the one resource a patient guerrilla always believed he had in abundance. A threat that can be outlasted is a threat you can be brave against, because bravery has always known how to endure a single bad moment and wait for it to pass. The Rome Plow was not a threat you could outlast because it did not wound the jungle. It removed it, roots and all, faster than any wound could form, and it left behind ground that could not heal in the time any war allows. That is why a simple, unarmed bulldozer, driven by a man doing nothing more dramatic than his job, could frighten a hardened guerrilla commander more deeply than a squadron of bombers ever managed to. The bombers threatened his life. The Rome Plow threatened the one condition his entire life and his entire war had always depended on, the simple, ancient fact that the jungle would always be there to hide him. And notice what this teaches about fear itself in war and everywhere else. We tend to assume the most frightening threat is the most violent one, the loudest, the most destructive in a single instant. But the deepest fears are often quieter than that. They are not the fears of pain or even of death. They are the fears of losing the foundation. Everything else stands on, the ground itself. The thing you never thought to question, the fact you built your whole strategy for survival on without ever imagining it could simply be taken away. Duck had prepared his whole life to be brave against bullets and bombs. Nothing had prepared him to watch the jungle disappear. This is a pattern that shows up far beyond one jungle in far more than one war. The threats that break people are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones that quietly remove an assumption so basic that no one thought to defend it, because no one thought it could ever be attacked. A soldier trains for combat. He does not train for the discovery that the ground he stands on can simply cease to exist as a hiding place. That is why the Rome Plow found a fear in Duke that the bombers, for all their violence, had never quite managed to reach. He stood at the edge of his base area in 1967 and watched an armored bulldozer tear his sanctuary out by the roots, and he understood in that moment that the war had just changed in a way no amount of courage could answer. The bombers could kill him. This machine could make sure that even if he lived, he would never again have anywhere left to hide. That is why the Viet Cong feared the Rome Plow more than airstrikes, not because it was more violent, because it was more permanent. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with the story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the machines and the ground they changed forever, on both sides of that long war. If it meant something to you, it genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, an engineer, a land-clearing crewman, an infantryman who worked beside them, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.